Hey guys, sorry not looking my best today. This is a very quick video. I found an article that I think is quite relevant and maybe help us to understand the impact that interviewing victims and the families of victims might actually have on them. So I've just done a voiceover, I've edited out some of the stuff that's specific to a case, and I think there's some really relevant points in there. So give it a listen if you're a creator and if you interview people, just to get a better understanding of what they would like to see from the way that they're treated.
Often, our interactions with the people who claim to be helping us get our story out there have ended up resurfacing feelings of exploitation and powerlessness that are associated with the original trauma. There is a cost to the telling and retelling of our stories. Judith Herman writes that trauma robs the victim of a sense of power and control over her own life. Therefore, the guiding principle of recovery is to restore power and control to the survivor. It has made me angry and distressed to see this fundamental aspect of trauma recovery overlooked by media through ignorance or through the business-as-usual model. I don't believe that most media professionals wake up in the morning wanting to harm someone. They just want to do a good job and would be delighted if they could have some tangible pointers about how to do no harm in the process. That's why I'd like to offer some preliminary thinking on a code of conduct that could be adopted for media interviews with survivors. The code should include informed consent for participation in interviews, filmed or otherwise. As Dr. Bruce Perry, founder of the Child Trauma Academy, confirms, survivors in these high-profile cases can either go into a cocoon of self-protection or else speak indiscriminately. Too often, I think, we survivors are misled into thinking that a kind reporter or sympathetic producer is a safe person, and then find ourselves re-traumatized by our subsequent lack of control in the editing and distribution of the interviews. Not only do survivors suffer a loss of power and control, but we also rarely benefit from the emotional culling of our stories. I would like to see a code of conduct for journalists and documentarians when working with trauma survivors. A code that will be upheld by those commissioning or paying for the end product. The code would include, at minimum, ongoing informed consent. This would involve explaining how much of the interview is likely to make it into the final edit, the themes that are likely to be selected, and the framing of the story, if that is already known. Predictability and trustworthiness, along with safety, collaboration, and offering choices, are important principles of trauma-informed practice. Psychoeducation for crew. Reporters and crews should know how the nervous system responds to trauma and how to support the interviewee. Some ways of supporting the interviewee. Limiting interviews to 1 hour. Offering choices, for example, of where to sit. Your ideal setup of bright lights, limited movement on a hard chair, and surrounding darkness may make for a good aesthetic but are all additional stressors on the nervous system of the interviewee. Offering breaks. Asking interviewees what helps when they are stressed, and encouraging them to use those techniques, e.g., shaking out their hands, sipping cold water, or taking deep breaths. If the interviewee gets stuck in an agitated, panicky state, hyperarousal, or conversely, withdraws or appears emotionally numb, hypoarousal, shut the interview down. Psychoeducation for survivors. It is important for survivors to understand how trauma affects the brain and nervous system, how trauma shows up in behavior, how to identify the signs that your nervous system is getting activated, and how to get it back in balance. The wide variety of body-based interventions that can help reverse the impacts of trauma. Factors that promote post-traumatic growth, not least of these being empowerment, reclaiming your power and your voice. Counseling for survivors. Depending on how much time the survivor has had to process the trauma, how recently they have gone public, and the degree of backlash, or deafening silence, surrounding their story, Survivors may need ongoing counseling support. An assessment for survivors to make sure they have supports in place before filming begins. It is not enough that the survivor wants to do the interview. If you were a family member, would you allow this person to sign important documents in their current state? If not, then why are you allowing them to decide to participate in something that might lead to future regret and embarrassment? Collaborative decision-making about edits, the chosen narrative, and the tenor of the marketing. I recognize this last point is a total reversal in the existing power structure in media. No one likes to give up power, and those who have it usually come up with all kinds of reasons not to relinquish it. Reporters and documentarians will argue that survivor input threatens objectivity. But if objectivity is the goal, then allow the survivor to comment on the chosen narrative once it becomes clear. If we disagree with how the information is being framed, this disagreement should also appear in the report or documentary. Isn't offering both sides of the story fundamental to objectivity? Ultimately, I would like to see some of the power and control shift to survivors so we can depict ourselves as exactly that. Survivors. We are survivors. We survived. We are strong and knowledgeable and have used our experiences to become empowered as activists, artists, teachers, and counselors. Who is making a documentary about that? I would also like to see information about trauma and resilience getting directly into the hands of survivors. It would be a huge first step for interviewers to be open-minded enough to imagine reporting in a collaborative style with trauma survivors. We are fed up with those who interview us but don't really listen to us, because they presume that an expertise in storytelling means they know better, even about trauma. In the language of trauma-informed care, we talk about taking on the role of compassionate witness as opposed to expert when interacting with a survivor, operating from a power with versus a power over approach. If more people in media were to embrace that approach, we would see better stories, more cooperation from those who quite understandably distrust media. And most importantly, we would empower survivors rather than re-traumatizing them.
So I'd love to know what you think of that. Maybe we should come up with some sort of guidelines or code of conduct for when we are talking about true crime stories, or especially when you're talking to survivors and the families and friends of those victims. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments, and if you've got any suggestions of what that code could be, either put them in the comments, or maybe on your channel you could discuss it with your subs, and we can start to come together with some sort of framework of what is appropriate and what isn't. Anyway, thanks for watching, and if you're in a true crime community, I'll see you in chat sometime, somewhere, maybe.